Witness this. Cairo, February 1260. 3 men kneel in the citadel courtyard, hands bound behind their backs. Mongol diplomats. They'd arrived 8 days earlier carrying a letter sealed with horsehair stamps, expecting the same reception they'd received in 40 other cities. Prostration, tribute negotiations, surrender. Instead, Sultan Qutuz had them dragged before the executioner's block. The first ambassador tried to speak, invoked diplomatic immunity in 3 languages, reminded everyone present that killing envoys meant total war. Qutuz nodded to the headsman. The blade came down, then the second, then the third. No trial, no ceremony, just 3 corpses and a pool of blood spreading across the stones. By sunset, their heads decorated the southern gate of Cairo on iron pikes, eyes still open, mouths frozen mid-protest. Crowds gathered to stare. Some cheered. Most stood silent, doing the math on what came next. The Mongol Empire had conquered from Korea to Poland without losing a major battle in 50 years. They'd just been given a reason to add Egypt to the list. This wasn't diplomacy. This was a declaration written in blood. Before we dive into these forgotten stories of survival and suffering, if you enjoy the hidden truths of history, hit like, subscribe, and tell me in the comments where you're listening from. To understand why this was fatal, you have to understand what arrived with those ambassadors. The letter Qutuz read before ordering the executions wasn't a negotiation. It was a verdict delivered in advance. Hulagu Khan, grandson of Genghis, conqueror of Baghdad, didn't write to offer terms. He wrote to announce what was already decided. The parchment unrolled to reveal phrases that had preceded the destruction of empires. You have heard how we have conquered a vast empire and purified the earth of disorders. It is for you to fly and for us to pursue. What land will shelter you? What road will you use to escape us? Our horses are swift, our arrows sharp, our swords like thunderbolts. Every ruler from China to Hungary had received some version of this letter. Most surrendered immediately. The ones who didn't became examples, pyramids of skulls, cities leveled to foundations, populations erased from the census. Hulagu's letter wasn't a threat. It was a job offer to join history's winning side, with the fine print written in the ashes of everyone who'd declined. Qutuz held the parchment in hands marked by old scars at the wrists, slavery scars. The commanders watching him waited for the response every rational leader gave: terms, tribute, time. He set the letter on the table between them, looked at the 3 Mongol ambassadors standing in his throne room with the casual arrogance of men representing the inevitable, and made a choice that violated every rule of medieval statecraft. He had them killed. But let's be clear about what the Mongols had already accomplished by the time that letter reached Cairo, because the scale changes everything. In 1206, Genghis Khan unified the Mongol tribes, steppe nomads most kingdoms considered irrelevant. 54 years later, his grandsons ruled the largest contiguous land empire in human history. They'd crushed China's Jin dynasty, annihilated the Khwarezmian Empire, conquered Russia, smashed Poland and Hungary in the same campaign season, and turned the word Mongol into something parents used to terrify children into obedience. The logistics alone defy summary. From Korea to Eastern Europe, 5,000 miles of conquest, 0 major defeats at their peak. Here's what that actually meant on the ground. When the Mongols arrived at Samarkand in 1220, the city held perhaps 100,000 people behind walls that had never fallen. Genghis offered the usual deal: surrender, pay tribute, live. The governor executed the Mongol envoys. 3 weeks later, Samarkand was rubble, and the Mongols had constructed a pyramid from 50,000 skulls as a monument to what happens when you choose wrong. Nishapur resisted in 1221. The Mongols killed everyone: men, women, children, dogs, cats, then leveled every building and plowed the ruins under. Estimated dead, 1.7 million. The city vanished from maps. When Baghdad fell in 1258, 2 years before our story, the Mongols ended the Abbasid Caliphate that had ruled the Islamic world for 5 centuries. They rolled the caliph in a carpet and had horses trample him to death, Mongol tradition for executing royalty without spilling blood directly. Then they spent a week methodically slaughtering between 200,000 and 1 million people, burning libraries that held 1,000 years of accumulated human knowledge and turning the Tigris River black with ink before it ran red with blood. You've heard the Mongols were unstoppable. That's not history. That's their public relations campaign. And it worked because they made it true through terror logistics. A city that surrendered lost 10% of its population to prove the Mongols' mercy wasn't weakness. A city that resisted lost everyone. Do that math. Make it credible by doing it repeatedly. Pretty soon, envoys arriving with letters don't need armies behind them. The reputation does the work. The Mongols had professionalized conquest. They used Chinese siege engineers, Korean naval experts, Persian administrators. They adopted the best technology from everyone they defeated and added it to a military system built on mobility, discipline, and the composite bow, a weapon that could punch through armor at 200 yards. Their cavalry moved faster than medieval communication systems, appearing where defenders thought they had weeks to prepare. They used psychological warfare like a scalpel. Surrender quickly, you might survive. Make us work for it. We'll make sure the next city hears what happened to you. 50 years of this. 50 years without a major loss. 50 years of every opponent making the wrong choice because there were no right choices. So when Hulagu's letter arrived in Cairo, it came with the weight of a half-century, proving the Mongols didn't bluff. Now here's the part that makes Qutuz interesting. He wasn't Egyptian. He was born Mahmud, nephew of the last Khwarezmian Shah who'd fought the Mongols and lost. He was 12 when the Mongol invasion destroyed his world. Palaces burning, family dead or scattered, everything he knew erased. He was captured, chained, marched west to slave markets, sold to an Egyptian emir, and funneled into the strangest military system in the medieval world, the Mamluks. The name means owned in Arabic. Slave soldiers sounds like a contradiction until you understand the system's brutal logic. Egypt's rulers purchased boys, 8 to 12 years old, from slave markets in the Caucasus, Central Asia, the steppes, took them from their families, converted them to Islam, trained them for a decade in mounted combat, archery, tactics, and Quranic scholarship. The boys who survived became the most elite cavalry in the Mediterranean world. The ones who excelled rose through ranks that bloodline couldn't buy. No family ties meant no divided loyalty. No homeland to retreat to meant you fought for your brothers in arms or you died alone. No inheritance to pass to sons meant every generation started fresh, hungry, proving themselves. It was military boarding school meets special forces selection, except you were 10 years old and you couldn't leave. By 1250, the Mamluks had staged a coup, killed the dynasty they'd served, and taken Egypt for themselves. They ruled as former slaves commanding an army of current slaves, bound by shared trauma and esprit de corps that made Roman legions look sentimental. When Qutuz rose to Sultan in 1259, 1 year before the Mongol letter arrived, he'd already survived being property, outlived the family that owned him, and maneuvered through palace politics lethal enough to make the Mongol threat feel almost straightforward. The men who would face the Mongol Empire had already survived being ripped from everything they knew as children. Fear was a familiar currency. So when Qutuz gathered his emirs in the council chamber to discuss Hulagu's letter, he faced men who understood impossible odds professionally. The letter sat on the carpet between them, like a live scorpion. Some emirs argued for submission, send tribute, buy time, hope the Mongol succession crisis kept Hulagu busy. Others wanted to flee south into Nubia, abandon Egypt, survive to rebuild. A few advocated fighting, but even they hedged, suggested defensive positions, talked about making the Mongols pay for every mile. One emir spoke the fear everyone felt. Baghdad fell in 12 days. The caliph died rolled in a carpet, trampled by horses. We have walls. We have soldiers. So did they. What makes us different? Qutuz let the question hang. Then he said something that locked them into the path. We know what they do to cities that surrender. The refugees told us. At least if we fight, we choose how we die. It wasn't inspirational. It was accounting. The Mongols had eliminated the middle options. Submit, and maybe 10% survive as broken vassals. Resist, and everyone dies, but you control the narrative. Qutuz chose the narrative, but he didn't choose defensive warfare. He chose execution. He took the 3 Mongol ambassadors, men protected by customs older than Islam, older than Christianity, and had them beheaded in his courtyard. Then he mounted their heads on Cairo's gates as a message that traveled faster than any military dispatch. Hulagu would hear about it within weeks. Every kingdom watching would understand. Egypt wasn't negotiating. Egypt was declaring war on the unkillable. Killing ambassadors was a war crime in 1260. Qutuz committed it deliberately, because submission was death in installments, and defiance required burning every bridge so thoroughly that retreat became impossible. He wasn't just rejecting Hulagu's offer. He was making surrender impossible for his own men. The heads on pikes told his emirs, "We're committed now. The Mongols will come for us specifically, and our only choice is to make them regret the letter." He'd locked his commanders in, locked Egypt in. The Mongol war machine that had crushed empires from the Pacific to Eastern Europe now had a reason to add Cairo to Baghdad on the list of cities that chose wrong. But to understand how a former slave planned to fight the most terrifying military force in human history, you need to understand what happened to Qutuz before he became sultan. Because the 12-year-old boy in chains, marching away from the burning ruins of everything he'd known, watching Mongol cavalry ride past his column of captives, that boy made a calculation that would matter 30 years later. The Mongols had taken his family, his name, his childhood. They'd turned him into property. They'd created him. And somewhere in those years of slavery and training and rising through Mamluk ranks by being sharper and harder than everyone around him, Qutuz decided he would return the favor. He would take something from them. He would teach the unkillable what it felt like to lose. The execution of the ambassadors wasn't rage, it was a resume. This is what defiance looks like when you've already survived the worst they can do. The story you know goes like this. Muslim armies defeat Mongol invaders. Faith triumphs over terror. David beats Goliath in the desert. Clean. Inspirational. Mostly wrong. The story that actually happened was a proxy war between former slaves and a Christian general, fought in a geopolitical vacuum created by a succession crisis in Mongolia, with Crusader kingdoms selling passage rights to both sides, while Frankish mercenaries and Armenian cavalry fought for the Mongols, and refugees flooding Egypt faster than the bureaucracy could process them. Faith mattered. So did logistics, slavery, murder, timing, and the fact that the Mongol Empire's communication system was too slow to coordinate an empire stretching from the Pacific to the Mediterranean when the guy in charge died suddenly in China. History is never clean. February 1260. The heads rotted on Cairo's gates while Qutuz tried to feed an army and a refugee crisis simultaneously. The execution of the ambassadors had been the easy part, dramatic, decisive, the kind of gesture that looks good in chronicles. Now came the accounting. Egypt's granaries held enough wheat for maybe 8 months if rationing started immediately. The Nile's flood cycle wouldn't arrive until summer. The Mamluk standing army needed 12,000 horses fed daily, each horse consuming forage equivalent to the caloric needs of 8 humans. Weapons production, Damascus steel blades, chainmail, lance shafts, arrows by the tens of thousands, required iron shipments from Anatolia that were no longer guaranteed now that the Mongols controlled the northern trade routes. And then there were the Syrians. They arrived in waves, thousands, then tens of thousands, fleeing south ahead of the Mongol advance. Families who'd lost everything in Aleppo, where the Mongols had massacred the population and burned the city to ashes. Merchants from Damascus who'd surrendered their city without a fight and now carried the guilt like a visible wound. Scholars who'd seen the libraries of Baghdad consumed by flames 2 years prior and understood that nowhere was safe, that 1,000 years of accumulated knowledge could vanish in an afternoon if you made the wrong calculation about whether to resist. They crowded the roads to Egypt, carts piled with whatever they could carry, children walking barefoot, the elderly dying before they reached the border. Qutuz toured the refugee camps outside Cairo's walls in March, walked between the makeshift shelters, the cook fires, the latrines dug too close to the water supply because there was nowhere else to put them. A woman grabbed his cloak, bold, desperate, and told him through cracked lips that the Mongols had killed her sons in Aleppo, made the family watch the executions, then released the survivors to spread the story. Then her eyes held a question. Was he going to save them, or just preside over a slower death? His emirs wanted the camps cleared. Too much strain on resources, too much disease risk, too much disorder when they needed every ounce of Egypt's capacity focused on military preparation. One counselor put it bluntly, "We can't feed our army and the refugees. Choose." Qutuz chose both, ordered the camps maintained, rations distributed, told the bureaucrats to make the math work. Not because he was compassionate, though maybe he was, but because every refugee was proof of what waited if Egypt fell. Walking testimonies to Mongol methodology, living arguments against the emirs who still whispered about submission in corners. The weight of what he was fighting for got heavier every time he visited those camps, because he'd been there. Different circumstances, different decade, but he'd walked those same roads in chains after the Mongols destroyed his childhood, except he'd been property instead of a refugee, and the distinction felt thin when he looked at the children's faces. But to understand why Qutuz believed he could win, you need to understand what the Mongols had already done to earn their reputation as unkillable. The Mongol system wasn't mystical. It was ruthlessly practical, technologically adaptive, and psychologically sophisticated in ways that wouldn't be codified in military doctrine for another 700 years. They'd professionalized terror, made it a weapon as precise as the composite bow. Hulagu Khan, the man whose letter had started this, was Genghis Khan's grandson and the embodiment of Mongol methodology applied with scientific precision. When he'd been assigned to conquer the Middle East in 1255, he'd approached it like an engineering problem. Built an army of 150,000, Mongol cavalry as the core, but supplemented with Chinese siege engineers who brought gunpowder and trebuchet designs, Korean naval specialists, Persian auxiliaries who knew the terrain, even Christian Georgian troops who saw the campaign as divine mission to reclaim the Holy Land from Muslim rule. Multinational, multi-specialist, logistically supplied through a communication network that stretched back to Karakorum in Mongolia, with relay stations every 25 miles, carrying messages faster than any kingdom's courier system. It was combined arms warfare centuries before the term existed, and Hulagu used it to erase Baghdad from relevance in 1258. The siege demonstrated everything that made the Mongols terrifying. The city had stood for 500 years as the capital of the Abbasid Caliphate, intellectual center of the Islamic world, home to perhaps 500,000 people behind walls that had never fallen to siege. The Caliph, al-Mustasim, believed his position descended from the Prophet Muhammad's bloodline gave him divine protection, believed the Muslim world would rally to defend the symbolic heart of their faith, believed negotiation was still possible, because surely the Mongols understood that destroying Baghdad would unite every Muslim kingdom against them. He believed wrong on every count. Hulagu's siege engines, Chinese-designed trebuchets that could hurl 300-pound stones with engineer-calculated trajectories, began the bombardment on January 29, 1258. The walls that had stood for half a millennium cracked under impacts delivered with industrial consistency. 12 days. That's how long it took to reduce Baghdad's defenses to rubble and breach the walls. On February 10th, Mongol cavalry poured through the gaps and the systematic killing began. They didn't massacre in rage, they massacred on schedule, block by block, street by street, building by building. The House of Wisdom, the library that had preserved Greek philosophy, Persian science, Indian mathematics, through centuries of Islamic scholarship, burned for days. Thousands of books thrown into the Tigris until the river ran black with ink. Then, the bodies started floating downstream and it ran red instead. The caliph was rolled in a carpet and trampled to death by horses, Mongol tradition for executing royalty without spilling their blood directly, a courtesy that made the symbolism more brutal. The 500-year-old caliphate ended with a man suffocating in Persian wool while hooves caved in his ribs. Death toll estimates range from 200,000 to 1 million. The real number is unknowable because the Mongols were thorough about erasing the census along with the population. Here's what made it worse than just mass killing: the efficiency. The Mongols had done this enough times to optimize the process. They killed fast in cities that resisted, slow in cities they wanted to make examples of, and with calculated mercy in cities that surrendered immediately. Baghdad got the full treatment because al-Mustasim had tried to negotiate from a position of imagined strength. The destruction was designed to be heard about, talked about, feared in every city from there to Cairo. Psychological warfare with a body count in 6 figures, and it worked. After Baghdad fell, Damascus surrendered without fighting when Mongol cavalry appeared on the horizon in early 1260. The governor did the math: resist and die like Baghdad, or submit and maybe survive, and chose survival. It was rational. It was pragmatic. It meant that by the time Qutuz was reading Hulagu's letter in Cairo, the Mongol Empire controlled everything from Syria to the gates of Egypt, with a track record of 0 defeats at their operational peak. So why hadn't they already crushed Egypt? Politics in Mongolia. The great Khan Munka had died in August 1259 during a campaign in China. Dysentery, or an arrow wound that went septic. Chronicles disagree on the details, but agree on the outcome. Dead Khan, on succession crisis. The Mongol Empire had a rule. When the great Khan dies, every prince of the blood has to return to Karakorum for the Kurultai, the great assembly that chooses the next leader. It was tradition, law, and the kill switch built into their system. Hulagu was Munka's brother, which made him a contender for the throne. He had to go back, had to leave the Middle Eastern campaign half-finished while he fought his other brothers for the biggest prize in the medieval world. So in late 1259, Hulagu withdrew the bulk of his army, maybe 100,000 troops, and marched them east toward Mongolia for a succession war that would take years to resolve. He left behind a holding force under his best general, Kitbuqa Noyan, with orders to maintain control of Syria and prepare for the eventual conquest of Egypt once the succession settled. 20,000 men. Against anyone else in 1260, that would have been enough. Kitbuqa was a believer. That's the first thing you need to understand about him. Mongol general, Nestorian Christian, 60-something years old, veteran of the Baghdad campaign, where he'd watched a Muslim caliphate burn and seen it as God's will. He'd risen through Mongol ranks by being competent and loyal, two virtues the empire rewarded regardless of your faith. Now he commanded the occupation of Syria with a coalition that looked like a crusade designed by people who'd actually read the tactical manuals. His core force, Mongol cavalry, the most mobile strike force in the medieval world. His allies, King Hethum of Armenia, who'd joined the Mongols willingly because he saw them as Christian liberators. Georgian nobles who'd sent contingents to fight under Kitbuqa's banner. Even some Frankish crusaders from Antioch, who'd calculated that a Christian Mongol general conquering Muslim Egypt was better than a Muslim Egypt conquering Christian Jerusalem. It was the strangest alliance of the 13th century. Steppe nomads, mountain Christians, and European knights united under a banner that combined Mongol horsehair standards with crosses. Kitbuqa looked at his maps of Syria and Egypt and saw divine mission. Looked at his 20,000 troops and saw enough because the Mongols had won with worse odds before. Looked at the Christian alliances and saw God's instrument finally positioned to finish what the Crusades had started. He told his Armenian allies, "We have broken the Caliphate. We will break the Sultans. When this is done, Jerusalem will be Christian again, and the churches will ring from here to Egypt." Faith wasn't his weakness. Overconfidence was, because he believed in the Mongol track record the way people believe in physics. Gravity works, composite bows penetrate armor at 200 yards, and the Mongols don't lose major battles. 50 years of evidence supporting that conclusion. Math made faith reasonable, except he was fighting someone who'd survived being property. The boy who became Qutuz was born Mahmud in Khwarazm, nephew to the last Shah who'd fought the Mongols and lost, 12 years old in 1231, when Genghis Khan's armies swept through his homeland like a force of nature, destroying cities, toppling dynasties, turning the Khwarezmian Empire from regional power to historical footnote in a single campaign season. Mahmud's family scattered. Some fled, some died, some were captured. He was captured, bound in chains with other children, marched west in a column of prisoners, while Mongol cavalry rode past them heading toward the next conquest. At that age, you don't understand geopolitics or military strategy. You understand that yesterday you had a name and a family and a palace, and today you have chains and a long walk toward being sold at auction. They sold him in Cairo to a Mamluk emir who saw potential in a boy who'd survived trauma without breaking. Put him in the barracks with other purchased children, Turks, Circassians, Kipchaks, boys taken from the Caucasus and Central Asia and the edges of the Mongol Empire, and subjected them to a decade of military conditioning that would make modern special forces selection look gentle. Up at dawn for mounted archery drills until your fingers bled from the bowstring. Sword work until muscle memory replaced thought. Quran recitation, because the Mamluks were building Muslim soldiers, not just killers. And always, always, the knowledge that you had no family to return to, no inheritance to protect, no identity except what you earned in this brotherhood of former slaves who'd chosen to make their chains into a weapon. The ones who survived became the best heavy cavalry in the Mediterranean. The ones who excelled became commanders. The exceptional ones became emirs. And Mahmud, who'd been 12 when the Mongols took everything, became Qutuz when he was 25 and stopped thinking of himself as property. By his 30s, he was commanding cavalry units. By his 40s, he was maneuvering through palace politics and making alliances, eliminating rivals, understanding that power in the Mamluk system went to whoever could fight and think and survive in an environment where advancement usually required a predecessor's death. In 1259, he staged the final move. The Sultan before him, weak, indecisive, more interested in harem politics than the Mongol threat growing in Syria, was removed. Histories differ on the exact mechanism, but agree on the outcome. Qutuz took the throne. Former slave. No bloodline. No dynastic claim. Just competence, timing, and the backing of enough emirs who understood that the Mongol crisis required someone harder than the comfortable peacetime rulers they'd tolerated before. He'd been sultan for exactly 1 year when Hulagu's letter arrived. 1 year to consolidate power. 1 year to prepare Egypt for what was coming. 1 year to look at maps and understand that the Mongol Empire had swallowed kingdoms with centuries more preparation time. But Qutuz had an advantage the textbooks miss, because it's written in bodies instead of documents. The Mamluk system produced soldiers with nothing to lose. Men who'd already survived being ripped from everything they knew as children, who'd built new identities from trauma and training, who fought not for inheritance or homeland, but for brothers in arms and the understanding that retreat meant death since they had nowhere to retreat to. It was military psychology forged through controlled abuse at scale, and it created units that didn't break under pressure because breaking had been trained out of them before they turned 15. Qutuz didn't explain this to his emirs when they debated Hulagu's letter. He just made them understand the choice: submit and die slowly as tributary vassals, or fight and die controlling the narrative. Then he executed the Mongol ambassadors to lock everyone into the second option. Because slaves understand leverage. You have none until you burn the safe options and make commitment the only choice. But he needed more than committed slaves. He needed someone who could think like the Mongols. Baibars al-Bundukdari sat in the council chamber watching Qutuz with one good eye and one pale blue eye clouded by a cataract that made him distinctive in a culture that valued physical perfection in warriors. Kipchak Turk, enslaved around 1242, sold to a Syrian emir who recognized talent and put him through Mamluk training that he dominated so completely, he'd become a legend in the barracks before he turned 20. By his 30s, Baibars commanded vanguard units and earned a reputation for tactical brilliance and absolute ruthlessness in equal measure. He could read terrain like scripture, anticipate enemy movements like he'd written their orders himself, and kill without hesitation when killing served strategic purpose. He was also ambitious in ways that made palace politics feel like blood sport. The kind of man who looked at sultans and saw temporary obstacles, who fought beside you today while calculating how to eliminate you tomorrow, who understood that loyalty in the Mamluk system lasted exactly as long as mutual advantage. When Qutuz proposed fighting the Mongols, Baibars supported it immediately, not from faith or patriotism, but from cold assessment. The Mongols were in his way. Kitbuqa's 20,000 troops in Syria was a manageable problem. Hulagu's full army returning after the succession settled would be unbeatable. The window existed now. Fight now, win now, deal with the political aftermath later. Qutuz fights the Mongols because they destroyed his past, Baibars told a fellow emir in private. I'll fight them because they're in the way of my future. Partnership in war is easy. It's victory that reveals who was using whom. They needed each other. Qutuz had the Sultanate, the authority, the political backing. Baibars had the tactical genius, the vanguard command, the battlefield instincts that could exploit the narrow window before Hulagu returned. Both understood that only one would remain after the crisis ended. Both accepted those terms because first they had to survive the crisis. So they began preparing Egypt for war while refugees flooded the camps and Kitbuqa's patrols probed south from Syria, testing Egyptian defenses. Qutuz ordered weapons production increased, granaries inventoried, cavalry units drilled in formations designed to counter Mongol mobility. Baibars studied maps of Palestine, looking for terrain that would negate the Mongol advantages, finding choke points and defensive positions that could turn numerical parity into tactical superiority. The emirs who'd argued for submission fell silent or found reasons to support the war effort because the executed ambassadors' heads were still rotting on Cairo's gates as a reminder of the choice they'd made. By June, intelligence reports confirmed Kitbuqa was moving forces into position for a summer campaign, and the Mongol general had spent the spring consolidating Syria, securing supply lines, gathering Christian allies, making the same preparations any competent commander would make before a major offensive. He had time. He had momentum. He had the track record of an army that hadn't lost in half a century. What he didn't know was that Qutuz wasn't planning to wait in Egypt. The defensive position made strategic sense. Force the Mongols to cross the Sinai Desert in summer heat. Fight behind Cairo's walls with supply lines secure. Every emir expected that plan. Some wanted it, defending from strength, letting the enemy exhaust themselves on the approach, using fortifications to multiply force effectiveness. Qutuz chose the opposite. July 1260, he ordered the Mamluk army to march north into Palestine to meet the Mongols on ground of his choosing. The emirs erupted in the council chamber. Leaving Egypt meant leaving its defenses, meant if they lost, the Mongols marched straight to Cairo unopposed, meant gambling everything on a single field battle against an opponent who'd won every field battle for 50 years. Baibars supported the plan instantly because he understood the psychology. Defenders wait, attackers choose. The side that picks the where controls the when, and the when determines the how. Fighting in Palestine meant choosing terrain, setting the tempo, making the Mongols react instead of dictate. It was aggressive, borderline suicidal, and tactically brilliant. If we lose in Palestine, the Mongols march straight to Cairo unopposed, a cautious emir said. If we wait in Cairo, we fight surrounded by refugees and low morale, Baibars answered. In Palestine, we choose the field. Qutuz ended the debate. The Mongols expect us to hide behind our walls. We'll kill them where they don't expect us. It wasn't bravado. It was the same calculation he'd made at 12 years old in chains, walking away from everything he'd known, understanding that survival required becoming someone else. The Mongols had created him. He would return the lesson. The Mamluk army assembled outside Cairo in mid-July, 20,000 cavalry and supporting infantry. Supply wagons. Horses that would need water every few hours marching through summer heat. Weapons, armor, siege equipment in case they needed to reduce Mongol positions in captured Syrian cities. The logistics alone stretched Egypt's capacity. Women and children watched from Cairo's walls as the columns formed up, understanding that if these men didn't return, neither would anyone else. Qutuz rode at the head of the army, looked back once at the city, the minarets, the Nile traffic, the refugee camps outside the walls, everything he was supposed to protect. If he lost, he'd never see it again. Neither would the 20,000 men riding behind him. They knew it. They rode anyway. Because the Mamluks were former slaves who'd been trained to understand that some choices eliminate all other options, and the only thing left is to make the choice matter. They marched north through the Sinai in July heat that killed horses and men who couldn't keep the pace. Crossed into Palestine where Crusader kingdoms watched them pass with calculated neutrality. Reached Acre, the great Frankish fortress, where Qutuz negotiated passage with lords who'd spent 2 centuries fighting Muslims and now had to choose between letting a Muslim army march through their territory or facing the Mongols alone after Egypt fell. The Crusader calculation was pure pragmatism. The Mongols were more dangerous long-term than the Mamluks. Christian general or not, Kitbuqa represented an empire that had already demonstrated it would destroy anyone. Christian, Muslim, Buddhist, didn't matter. Who stood in the way of conquest? The Franks sold Qutuz passage rights, collected payment, and watched the Mamluk cavalry ride north toward the confrontation everyone knew was coming. By late August, scouts reported Kitbuqa's army moving south from his base at Baisan. 20,000 Mongols, Armenians, Georgians, some Frankish mercenaries, moving with the confidence of an army that had never lost, heading toward Egypt with orders to finish what Baghdad had started. Baibars studied the scout reports and pointed at his map. A valley in Galilee, springs providing water, wooded hills on both sides, narrow enough to constrain Mongol mobility, open enough to deploy cavalry effectively. Named Ain Jalut, spring of Goliath. Biblical resonance that Baibars didn't care about but Qutuz noted. The valley forces them narrow, Baibars said. They can't flank what they can't ride around, and the hills give us the ambush. Qutuz looked at the map, then at the name. Spring of Goliath, where the giant fell. The irony was heavy enough to feel like prophecy, but Qutuz had stopped believing in prophecy at 12 when the Mongols killed his family and sold him into slavery. He believed in terrain, training, and timing. We take position in the hills, he said. Let them come to us. The forces were moving into position now. Kitbuqa from the north, with the weight of empire behind him and the confidence of 50 years without defeat. Qutuz from the south with an army of former slaves who'd been trained to understand that fear was just another weapon, and weapons cut both ways. Between them, a valley that would force one side's strength into a choke point and turn the other side's desperation into advantage. September was 3 days away. The Mongols were coming. The Mamluks were waiting. And in a spring named for a giant who'd fallen to a shepherd's stone, 2 armies were about to test whether history's patterns held or broke. Here's what Qutuz understood that most defenders miss. Waiting for the enemy to arrive means fighting on their timeline, at their tempo, under their psychological pressure. Every day you wait is a day they control the narrative. Every report of their approach is another chance for your men to calculate the odds and find them wanting. Defense sounds safe until you realize it's just slow-motion submission dressed in military language. So he chose speed. The Mamluk army crossed into Palestine in late July with the kind of pace that kills stragglers and horses that can't maintain the rhythm. 20,000 cavalry moving through terrain that offered minimal water sources, summer heat that turned armor into ovens by midday. Supply lines stretched thin enough that a single raid could starve the entire force. The emirs who'd argued against this march now rode with the column anyway, because the alternative was staying in Cairo, waiting for news of their army's destruction. At least riding north meant you controlled your death instead of waiting for it to arrive. Qutuz pushed them hard, 30 miles some days when the terrain allowed, 20 when it didn't. Scouts ranged ahead looking for water sources and Mongol patrols. The vanguard under Baibars rode a day ahead of the main force, close enough to support if engaged, far enough to give the army warning if they ran into Kitbuqa's forces before the ground was chosen. It was aggressive reconnaissance that assumed contact was inevitable and made peace with that assumption. The army reached Acre in early August, but the fortress rose from the coastal plain like a monument to 2 centuries of crusader failures. Massive walls, deep harbors, the wealth of Mediterranean trade concentrated behind fortifications that had held against Saladin and would probably hold against anyone else who tried. The problem was that Qutuz needed passage through Crusader territory to reach the battlefield he'd chosen, and the Franks had spent 200 years fighting Muslims with the kind of commitment that made negotiation feel like betrayal of every knight who died in the Holy Land. The meeting happened in Acre's citadel with Frankish lords who looked at Qutuz the way you'd look at a snake that might be venomous or might just be rope. Their calculation was transparent. Let a Muslim army march through Christian territory or face the Mongols alone after Egypt fell. And the arithmetic wasn't subtle. One lord said it plainly, voice heavy with centuries of religious warfare that suddenly mattered less than survival. "We've fought you for 200 years. Why should we let you march through our lands?" Qutuz didn't offer theology or appeals to shared humanity. He offered accounting. "Because if we lose to the Mongols, you're next, and they won't negotiate." The Franks knew it was true. Kitbuqa might be Christian, but he served Mongol interests, and Mongol interests included every piece of territory from the Pacific to the Mediterranean, regardless of what god you prayed to. The Crusader kingdoms had watched the Mongols destroy Baghdad, Damascus, Aleppo, had seen Christian allies fight under Mongol banners and Christian cities burn when they resisted. Faith mattered less than physics when an empire that large decided you were next on the list. They sold passage, took payment in gold and the promise of non-aggression once the Mongol crisis resolved. Watched Mamluk cavalry ride north through their territory with expressions that mixed pragmatism and disgust in equal measure. Crusaders making deals with Muslims to fight Christians allied with Mongols. The ironies were heavy enough to feel like mockery of every theological justification both sides had used to kill each other for 2 centuries. But irony doesn't stop arrows. Qutuz rode through Acre knowing the Franks would break this alliance the moment it suited them, probably within months of the battle's resolution. Baibars knew it too, rode beside him through the city gates with the look of a man filing information for later use. My temporary allies were just future targets with better timing. The Mamluks understood this professionally because their entire military system was built on former slaves who'd learned to trust no one but the brother next to them in formation. By mid-August, the scouts brought word. Kitbuqa's army was moving south from Baisan, his base of operations in northern Palestine. 20,000 troops, Mongol cavalry corps with Armenian, Georgian, and some Frankish auxiliary units, marching with the confidence of an army that had never known defeat. The reports described Mongol discipline that looked effortless, camps that appeared at sunset and vanished at dawn, horses that maintained pace for days without foundering, formations that moved like single organisms responding to signals most armies wouldn't even notice. Baibars spread the scout reports across a table in the command tent and pointed at the geography between the 2 armies. They're moving down the Jordan Valley. 3 routes to reach Egypt from there. Eastern route takes them through desert. Too slow, too exposed. Western route brings them along the coast through Crusader territory. Possible, but constrained by fortresses they'd have to reduce or bypass. Center route runs through Galilee. His finger traced a valley on the map. Springs marked with blue ink. Hills sketched on either side. Narrow enough to constrain, but wide enough to deploy forces. Here, Ain Jalut, Spring of Goliath. Qutuz studied the terrain features. The valley ran roughly east-west, maybe 2 miles long and half a mile wide at its widest point. Wooded hills on the northern and southern edges provided cover for hidden forces. The springs themselves, the reason for the name, meant water for men and horses, a resource you couldn't ignore in late summer Palestine. Anyone moving through this region toward Egypt would have to either pass through this valley or take a longer route around it that added days to the march and exposed them to harassment. "What makes you think Kitbuqa will come through here?" an emir asked. Baibars didn't look up from the map. "Because it's the fastest route, and the Mongols win by speed. They don't detour. They don't slow down. They hit the most direct line between where they are and where they're going, and they destroy anything in the way. Ain Jalut is the most direct line." It was simple, brutally, dangerously simple. But Mongol success came from doing simple things with overwhelming competence. They didn't need complex strategy when speed and discipline and 50 years of psychological momentum did the work. Kitbuqa would see the valley, see the springs, see the direct route to Egypt, and take it because detouring suggested caution, and the Mongols had never needed caution before. "The hills hide how many?" Qutuz asked. 15,000 if we pack them tight. More if we're willing to risk visible movement when they deploy. Qutuz looked at the map, then at Baibars, then back at the valley sketched in ink that would soon be drawn in blood. The plan crystallized with the kind of clarity that feels either like genius or suicide depending on the outcome. Take the vanguard, small, visible, vulnerable-looking, into the valley as bait. Hide the main force in the wooded hills on both sides. Wait for Kitbuqa to take what looked like an easy victory. Spring the trap when his army was committed and constrained by terrain that turned Mongol mobility into a liability instead of an advantage. It was a Mongol tactic. The feigned retreat, the ambush, the use of terrain to negate numerical or tactical disadvantage. Except this time the Mongols would be the ones chasing what looked like prey into a kill box designed by someone who'd studied their methods and understood that the best way to beat a system is to make it beat itself. "You're the bait," Qutuz said to Baibars. "I know. If the timing breaks, if they don't commit fully, if they smell the trap, then I die in the valley and you lose your vanguard, and probably the battle." Baibars said it without emotion, stating logistics. "But if it works, we kill them where they can't maneuver. The hills take away their advantage. The constraint forces close combat. Our heavy cavalry against their light cavalry in tight quarters." Another emir spoke up, older, cautious, the kind of voice that survives palace politics by never committing fully to any plan. "This requires perfect timing, perfect discipline. If any unit breaks formation early, if the Mongols see movement in the hills before we spring the trap, then we die," Qutuz finished. "Same as if we sit in Cairo waiting for them to arrive with Hulagu's full army after the succession settles. Same as if we try to fight them on open ground where they can use mobility to surround and destroy us piece by piece. Every option kills us. This one at least kills us on ground we chose." The tent was silent, except for the sound of wind pulling at canvas and the distant noise of 20,000 men making camp. Someone had to say it, make it real, commit the force to a plan that required perfection from an army of former slaves facing an empire that had spent half a century proving perfection was their standard. Baibars said it. "When do we move?" "Tomorrow," Qutuz answered. "We reach Ain Jalut in 2 days, take position in the hills, and wait for Kitbuqa to come to us." The die was cast, not thrown, cast. The difference being that thrown dice might land in your favor by chance, while cast dice are already committed to the mold, and you're just waiting to see if the shape that emerges matches what you needed. But there were problems. There are always problems when you're trying to hide 15,000 cavalry in wooded hills while keeping them fed, watered, and quiet enough that Mongol scouts don't detect the trap before it closes. First problem, water. The springs at Ain Jalut could support maybe 5,000 men and horses comfortably. 20,000 troops competing for the same water source meant rationing, meant discipline, meant some units going thirsty while others drank so that everyone stayed functional. Baibars' vanguard would have access to the springs since they'd be visible in the valley. The hidden forces in the hills would have to make do with what they carried or go without until the battle resolved. Second problem, patience. You can train men to charge into arrows. You can train them to hold formation under pressure. Untraining them to sit silent in a tree line for hours or days while enemy scouts probe the area and the sun bakes them in their armor, and every instinct screams to move, to act, to do something. That's harder. Especially when the men you're training are Mamluks who've been conditioned since childhood to be aggressive, to take initiative, to solve problems with violence instead of waiting. Third problem, Baibars himself. Qutuz needed him for this plan because Baibars was the only commander skilled enough to execute a controlled retreat under pressure that looked convincing enough to draw Mongol pursuit without looking so panicked that Kitbuqa smelled the trap. But Baibars was also ambitious enough that giving him the glory position, the bait that would be remembered, and the dramatic role that chronicles would write about, felt like handing a rival the material for his own legend. And legends in the Mamluk system were currency you spent to buy loyalty from emirs who respected competence more than bloodline. Qutuz made the calculation anyway. Survival first, politics later. If they lost at Ain Jalut, there would be no politics to worry about because they'd all be dead and Egypt would be the next Baghdad. If they won, he'd deal with Baibars' increased prestige the same way you deal with any ambitious subordinate. Carefully, with friends in the right places, and with the understanding that betrayal was always an option someone would eventually exercise. The army moved to Ain Jalut on August 31st. 2 days of forced march through terrain that got progressively hillier, rockier, and less forgiving to cavalry who needed flat ground to maintain formation. They arrived at the valley in the late afternoon of September 2nd, 1260. The springs were exactly where the scouts had reported. Clear water bubbling up from underground sources, pools that reflected sky, grass that stayed green even in late summer because the water table was high enough to support growth. It looked peaceful. Qutuz stood at the spring and thought about the name. Goliath, the giant who'd terrorized an army until a shepherd with a sling dropped him. The biblical resonance was almost too perfect, the kind of symbolism that would show up in chronicles written years later by historians who loved clean narratives more than messy reality. But standing there with the valley stretching out around him and the hills rising on both sides, Qutuz understood why the name mattered. Sometimes you need the story to believe the outcome is possible, even when the math says otherwise. Baibars began positioning his vanguard immediately. 1,000 cavalry, picked troops, veterans, men who understood they were being asked to run from the most terrifying army in the world while trusting that the hammer would fall at exactly the right moment. They made camp at the springs visible from any approach, looking like a small raiding force or advance guard that had overextended itself. Vulnerable, tempting. The main force moved into the hills under cover of darkness. 15,000 men and horses finding positions in the tree line on both sides of the valley, spreading out along the ridgelines, on trying to stay hidden while maintaining formation integrity so that when the signal came, they could deploy quickly instead of emerging in a disorganized mob. It was like trying to hide a city in a forest. Possible in theory, deadly if someone made a mistake. Qutuz took personal command of the southern hill positions, put himself with the troops who'd have the longest charge when the trap sprung, who'd hit the Mongol flank at the critical moment when Kitbuqa's army was fully committed to the valley and couldn't easily disengage. It was the high-risk position, the place where victory would be decided or lost. Commanders who fight from the front don't live long, but they earn loyalty from men who notice that their leader bleeds first. The night of September 2nd passed slowly, men trying to sleep in armor on hillsides while horses stood hobbled between trees and officers moved quietly through the lines, reminding everyone to stay silent, stay hidden, wait for the signal. No fires, no noise, nothing that would alert Mongol scouts that the valley they were approaching held 20,000 troops instead of a small advance guard. Dawn on September 3rd came with clear skies and heat that would be brutal by midday. Qutuz stood in the tree line looking down at Baibars' vanguard at the springs below. Watched them water their horses, move through morning drills, present the appearance of a force that didn't know what was coming. Watched and waited for the scouts to bring word that Kitbuqa was approaching. The word came at mid-morning. Mongol cavalry sighted to the northeast, maybe 3 hours away at their current pace. 20,000 troops moving in the disciplined columns that had carried the Mongol Empire across half the world. Kitbuqa at their head with the confidence of a general who'd never lost a battle because the army he commanded hadn't lost a battle in half a century. Qutuz passed the word, hold position, stay quiet, wait for the Mongols to commit. Then he drew his sword and checked the edge, even though he'd already checked it twice that morning and would check it again before the fighting started. Muscle memory. The small rituals you do before violence to convince yourself you're ready, even when the math says you're about to die. Baibars' vanguard in the valley below began preparing for the performance. Horses saddled, weapons ready, in the kind of loose alertness that suggested they might have seen scout reports but hadn't fully grasped the danger. Men who looked confident enough to hold position, but not so confident they'd forgotten caution. It had to be perfect. Too relaxed, and Kitbuqa would suspect a trap. Too alert, and he'd know something was wrong before committing his forces. By noon, the Mongol scouts appeared on the eastern edge of the valley. 3 riders moving fast, stopping on the ridgeline to survey the terrain below. From Qutuz's position in the southern hills, he could see them clearly. Small horses, composite bows, the easy competence of men who'd spent their lives in the saddle and knew cavalry tactics the way other people knew prayer. They saw Baibars' vanguard at the springs, saw a small force, maybe 1,000 men, vulnerable and exposed, saw the tactical opportunity that competent generals recognize instantly: destroy the advance guard, demoralize the enemy, create momentum before the main battle. The scouts turned and rode back to report. Now came the waiting. The worst part of any ambush is the gap between spotting the enemy and engaging them. The time when you're committed but not yet moving. When doubt creeps in and every man in the hidden position starts calculating whether this will work or whether they're about to die in a hillside tree line because their sultan decided to fight the unkillable. Qutuz moved through his section of the line, not speaking, just being visible, reminding them by presence that he was here, in the front rank, committed to the same gamble. The men saw him and steadied, and that's what leadership is at the sharp end, being present in the moment when presence is all anyone needs to keep fighting instead of running. The sound came first. Drums. Mongol war drums that carried across distance, announcing approach, building psychological pressure. Then the horns, deep, resonant, the kind of sound that makes your chest vibrate and your hands sweat on weapon grips. Then the thunder, not actual thunder, but the sound of 20,000 horses moving at speed, hoofbeats multiplying into a continuous roar that shook the ground. They appeared at the eastern edge of the valley like a flood cresting a ridge. Mongol cavalry in formations that flowed across terrain instead of fighting it. Banners with horsehair standards. Riders who sat their horses with the kind of ease that comes from spending more time mounted than walking. At their head, Kitbuqa, old and hard and Christian, and convinced that God had positioned him to finish what the Crusades had started. He saw Baibars' vanguard at the springs and made the decision every military chronicle would later debate. He charged. The Mongol cavalry accelerated from approach to attack in seconds, formations spreading wide to envelop the small force at the springs, composite bows coming out for the opening volleys that would soften the target before close combat finished it. 20,000 troops moving to destroy 1,000 with the confidence of an army that had done this 100 times before. In the southern hills, Qutuz watched Baibars' vanguard respond exactly as planned. They didn't stand and fight. They didn't form defensive positions. They ran, mounted up and rode west toward the narrow end of the valley in what looked like panicked flight, arrows falling around them, Mongol cavalry gaining, the whole thing appearing to be exactly what Kitbuqa would expect. An isolated force recognizing too late that they'd been caught and making a desperate attempt to escape. The Mongols pursued. Of course, they pursued. It's what you do when your enemy breaks before contact. You run them down, kill them while they're scattered, prevent them from reforming. Standard doctrine. The Mongols had perfected it across 5,000 miles of conquest. Kitbuqa's army poured into the valley after Baibars' retreating vanguard, spreading out as they gained, some units moving toward the hills to cut off escape routes, our most driving straight west to overtake the fleeing Mamluks before they could reach open ground. The valley filled with Mongol cavalry, constrained by the terrain into a space maybe half a mile wide, compressed by pursuit into a formation denser than they'd normally maintain, focused entirely on the retreating enemy in front of them. In the tree line on both sides of the valley, 15,000 Mamluk cavalry sat frozen, watching the Mongols commit fully to the pursuit, waiting for the signal, hands tight on reins and weapon grips, every instinct screaming to charge now, before the Mongols realized the trap. Qutuz waited. Let the Mongols push deeper. Let them spread out. Let them focus completely on Baibars' vanguard until the thought of hidden forces became impossible, because surely, if there were hidden forces, they would have already sprung the trap. Baibars' vanguard reached the western end of the valley, the point where the terrain narrowed further and escape became impossible. They wheeled around, forming a ragged line that looked half-panicked, trying to make a stand because flight had failed. The Mongols closed in for the kill. Close enough now that Qutuz could see individual faces, expressions of confidence that came from knowing you were about to finish what you'd started, knowing that this was just another broken enemy joining the list of everyone else who'd tried to resist. Qutuz raised his hand, held it high enough for every commander in his section of the line to see, and the signal that would start the killing or the dying, that would prove the plan brilliant or suicidal, that would either save Egypt or destroy the last force capable of resisting Mongol expansion into Africa. He dropped his hand. The hills erupted. Act 4. The battle. The sound hit first, 15,000 cavalry exploding from tree lines on both sides of the valley simultaneously, drumming that drowned out thought, metal rattling as formations surged forward, officers shouting commands that would be the last words many men heard. Then came the sight. Mamluk, heavy cavalry, pouring down hillsides in waves that compressed into a wedge of horseflesh and steel, and men who'd been trained since childhood to hit at full gallop with lances that weighed as much as a grown man. The Mongols in the valley saw them coming and froze for maybe 3 seconds. The gap between confidence and recognition, between thinking you're pursuing broken enemies and understanding you've ridden into a prepared kill zone. 3 seconds where officers tried to shout warnings, tried to reform scattered pursuit units into defensive positions, tried to do anything except what was about to happen. Those 3 seconds were the battle. A Mongol officer near the southern edge of the valley wheeled his horse, screaming at his unit to form up, to face the charge coming down the hillside. His voice carried maybe 30 yards before a Mamluk lance caught him in the chest and lifted him out of his saddle. The lance shattered on impact. The officer flew backward, armor crumpling inward where the point had entered, and hit the ground already dead, momentum carrying his body another 10 feet in a tumble that ended with his neck bent wrong. That was the first death anyone could confirm later. There would be thousands more before sunset. The Mamluk charge hit the Mongol formations like a hammer striking glass. The front rank of Kitbuqa's cavalry, men who'd been focused on Baibars' retreating vanguard, took the impact without preparation, without formation integrity, without the defensive positions that might have let them survive the first contact. Lances punched through leather armor into ribs and lungs. Horses collided at speed, half-ton animals meeting in impacts that shattered legs and spines. Men went down and disappeared under hooves, trampled into mud that was dirt 1 second and blood-soaked ground the next. Qutuz was in the front rank of the southern charge. He'd committed to it the moment he took position in the hills, committed to leading from the front because Mamluks followed competence and courage in equal measure, and you couldn't ask for one without demonstrating the other. His lance caught a Mongol rider in the shoulder, splintering on impact, the shock running up his arm hard enough to numb his hand. He dropped the broken shaft and drew his sword in one motion, muscle memory taking over because thinking was too slow for cavalry combat at speed. The Mongol he'd hit was still in his saddle, left arm useless, trying to draw a weapon with his right hand, while his horse panicked and spun. Qutuz's sword came down across the man's neck at an angle that took him just below the helmet edge. The blade bit deep, stuck for a second in bone, then came free as momentum carried Qutuz past. The Mongol fell. Qutuz didn't see him land. There were too many other targets, too much chaos, too much happening in every direction to track individual deaths. The valley became a slaughterhouse defined by density. 20,000 Mongols compressed into a space half a mile wide, unable to maneuver, unable to use their primary advantage, the composite bow fired from horseback while moving at speed. Because there was no room to move and no distance to shoot from, 15,000 Mamluks hitting them from both sides simultaneously in the kind of coordinated assault that required more discipline than most medieval armies could maintain under any circumstances, much less in the chaos of first contact. It was working. The trap was working. Qutuz felt it in the resistance. I felt it in the way Mongol formations buckled instead of absorbing the charge, felt it in the faces of enemy soldiers who were starting to show something the Mongols rarely showed: uncertainty. But working didn't mean easy. The Mongols were still the most professional military force in the medieval world. They'd won 100 battles by adapting faster than their opponents, by finding solutions under pressure, by refusing to break even when logic said they should. Kitbuqa started reforming his center, pulling scattered units into a defensive position around the valley floor, creating a nucleus of disciplined troops who could form a shield wall and use their composite bows to create kill zones that would slow the Mamluk assault. Arrows started flying, not the mass volleys that Mongol cavalry normally unleashed from distance, but precise shots at close range, aimed fire from archers who could see their targets clearly enough to hit weak points in armor. A Mamluk rider, 3 horses to Qutuz's left, took an arrow through the eye slit in his helmet. He made no sound, just fell backward off his horse, dead before his body hit the ground. Another arrow hit a horse in the throat. The animal screamed, high-pitched, horrible, and collapsed, throwing its rider into the press, where he disappeared under hooves from both sides. The momentum of the initial charge was slowing, grinding, turning from impact to sustained combat where men hacked at each other from horseback with swords and axes, where horses bit and kicked, where the wounded fell and were trampled, where exhaustion started to become a factor alongside fear and adrenaline. Qutuz pushed forward and trying to maintain pressure, trying to keep the Mamluks moving before the Mongol discipline reasserted itself fully. His sword arm was numb from impacts. His horse was bleeding from a cut along its shoulder, not deep enough to be fatal, but deep enough that blood soaked into the saddle. Around him, the faces of his bodyguard, men who'd been assigned to keep him alive and were doing it by killing anyone who got close enough to threaten. One of them, a young Mamluk named Karim, who'd been in the barracks when Qutuz was coming up through the ranks, took a sword thrust meant for Qutuz and fell from his saddle without a sound. Gone. Just gone. Another body in the press. The center of the valley was becoming impossible to navigate. Dead horses created obstacles. Dead men created more obstacles. And the ground turned slick with blood and worse. The contents of ruptured bodies, the fluids that leak from torn flesh, the waste that spills when abdominal wounds open. Horses lost footing. Riders fell. The density meant that once you were down, you didn't get up. Hooves didn't distinguish between enemy corpses and friendly wounded. And then the Mamluk assault stalled. Not broke. Stalled. The difference being that broken means fleeing in panic, while stalled means hitting resistance solid enough that forward momentum becomes impossible without regrouping. Kitbuqa's defensive position in the center was holding. His archers were creating enough casualties to make the Mamluk charge prohibitively expensive. His cavalry was recovering from the initial shock and starting to fight back with the competence that had carried the Mongol Empire across half the world. Qutuz saw it happening, saw his forces starting to take more casualties than they inflicted, saw Mamluk units pulling back to regroup, creating gaps in the assault that Mongol cavalry could exploit, saw the possibility of victory starting to slip because the Mongols were doing what they always did, adapting faster than their opponents expected. He needed to restart the momentum, needed to give his troops something that would override the natural human instinct to pull back from a fight that was killing them, needed to be the thing that broke the stalemate before the stalemate broke his army. So he removed his helmet, held it high above his head where every Mamluk in the center of the valley could see it, and shouted with everything in his lungs, "Wa Islama!" For Islam, the ancient war cry, the thing you shouted when you'd made peace with dying and just needed everyone around you to understand that retreat wasn't an option, that this was the moment where faith and fate intersected, and the only choice was to push forward into the place where heroes and corpses were separated by inches and luck. Then, Qutuz charged directly at Kitbuqa's defensive position. Not a tactical maneuver, not a strategic calculation. Just pure commitment, riding into arrow range, into lance range, into the exact place where generals aren't supposed to be, because dead generals lose battles even when their armies win. His bodyguard followed because they had no choice. Then the emirs followed, because watching your sultan charge alone was worse than dying. Then the entire Mamluk force followed, because collective shame is a stronger motivator than individual courage, and no one wanted to be the man who held back while everyone else rode into the killing ground. The second wave hit harder than the first because it wasn't a planned assault. It was every Mamluk in the valley charging simultaneously at the Mongol center with the kind of desperate aggression that comes from watching your leader bet his life on the outcome. Kitbuqa's defensive position, solid seconds earlier, buckled under the weight of 15,000 cavalry, hitting it from multiple angles at once. And somewhere in the chaos, and Baibars' vanguard, the bait that had drawn the Mongols into the valley, wheeled around from their false retreat and charged back into the fight from the west. Fresh troops, unbloodied, hitting the Mongol rear while Qutuz's forces pressed the center and flanks. The Mongol formation broke, not all at once, not dramatically, just started to fragment under pressure that was coming from every direction simultaneously, pressure that overwhelmed their capacity to respond coherently. Units pulled back without orders. Gaps appeared in the defensive line. The disciplined archers who'd been creating kill zones started dying as Mamluk cavalry broke through and cut them down at close range where bows were useless. Kitbuqa saw it happening. The old general, Christian believer, veteran of 100 victories, I watched his army start to disintegrate in a valley in Galilee and made the choice that every chronicle would later analyze. He refused to retreat, gathered his personal guard, maybe 100 riders, and charged toward the center of the Mamluk assault, trying to rally his troops by example, trying to demonstrate that the Mongols didn't break, didn't run, didn't surrender even when the odds said they should. He was still shouting orders when a Mamluk lance caught him in the side. The armor held for a second, then failed. The point went through, angled up into his chest cavity, collapsed a lung, and probably nicked his heart. Kitbuqa stayed in the saddle, old warrior reflexes keeping him upright even as blood filled his chest and breathing became impossible. His guard closed around him, trying to create space, trying to pull him back to safety. But there was no safety. The Mamluks surged forward, seeing the Mongol command group exposed, understanding that killing Kitbuqa would break the Mongol morale permanently. Swords and axes hacked through the guard. Men who'd spent decades fighting beside their general died in seconds, cut down by sheer numbers. Kitbuqa fell from his horse, not thrown, not pulled, just fell as his strength gave out and gravity became stronger than will. He hit the ground face first. A Mamluk rider's horse trampled his back, then another, then more as the cavalry surged forward, not seeing the body in the chaos, just fighting forward into the space where the Mongol command had been. By the time the immediate combat moved past that position, Kitbuqa Noyan, Christian general of the Mongol Empire, was pulped meat mixed with mud and blood. His banner fell seconds later. A Mamluk grabbed the horsehair standard and cut it down, held it high for everyone to see. The signal was immediate and devastating. Mongol units across the valley saw their commander's banner fall and made the calculation that had protected their lives through decades of conquest. This battle is lost. Survival requires retreat. Dying for honor is glorious, but living to fight another day is practical. They ran. The Mongol retreat started as a trickle, individual riders breaking from combat, turning east toward the open ground beyond the valley, riding hard for escape. Then it became a flood. Whole units disengaging, formations abandoning coherence in favor of speed. Every man making the same calculation that their survival mattered more than the battle. The Mamluks pursued. It's what you do when your enemy breaks. You kill them while they're vulnerable, while their backs are turned, while they're more focused on escape than defense. The pursuit turned the valley into a massacre. Mongol riders cut down from behind, horses foundering under exhausted riders, men throwing down weapons and trying to surrender only to discover that the Mamluks weren't interested in prisoners when the alternative was making sure the survivors wouldn't regroup for another attack. Baibars led the pursuit with the kind of ruthless efficiency that made him terrifying. His vanguard, still relatively fresh compared to the troops who'd fought in the initial assault, ran down fleeing Mongols for miles beyond the valley, in killing until their horses couldn't maintain the pace and the remaining Mongols scattered into terrain that made organized pursuit impossible. By sunset, the killing slowed from massacre to cleanup. The Mamluks held the valley and the ground east of it. The Mongols who'd survived, maybe a quarter of Kitbuqa's original force, were fleeing north toward what remained of Mongol-held Syria, scattered, demoralized, carrying the news that the unkillable had been killed. Ain Jalut Valley in the evening light looked like an abattoir. Bodies everywhere. So many that you couldn't walk 20 feet without stepping on or over a corpse. Dead horses outnumbered dead men 2 to 1, their bulk creating obstacles that would have to be moved before the ground was usable again. The springs ran red, literally, on water mixing with blood from thousands of wounds until the pools that had been clear that morning looked like something from a nightmare. The wounded made sounds that would haunt survivors for years, screaming, begging, praying in half a dozen languages. Some could be helped, most couldn't. The ones who couldn't be helped got mercy killings from Mamluk soldiers who understood that slow death from abdominal wounds or crushed spines was worse than a quick blade across the throat. Qutuz dismounted near the springs, his horse finally done after hours of combat and pursuit. The animal was shaking, covered in blood, some its own, most from others, and when he tried to lead it to water, it collapsed and didn't get up. Just lay there, breathing hard, eyes rolling, beyond exhaustion, into the place where the body starts shutting down to protect itself. He walked through the battlefield alone as darkness fell, stepped over bodies of men who'd been under his command that morning and were corpses now, saw faces he recognized, emirs he'd argued with in council chambers, soldiers he'd watched train in Cairo barracks, young Mamluks who'd been property like he'd been property and had chosen to believe that this fight mattered enough to die for. The cost was obscene. Mamluk casualties were maybe 20 to 30%, lower than the Mongol losses, but still thousands of men who'd been alive at dawn and were dead by dusk. Egypt had won. Qutuz had won. The Mongols had been stopped for the first time in half a century. And all it had cost was a valley full of corpses and the knowledge that this victory had bought Egypt. Maybe a year before, either the Mongols returned with a larger force or internal politics destroyed what the battle had preserved. He found Kitbuqa's body near the center of the valley, trampled, broken, barely recognizable as human. The old general who'd believed God was on his side, who'd thought the Mongol track record was destiny instead of just accumulated momentum, who'd ridden into this valley confident and died in the mud. Qutuz looked at the body and felt nothing. No triumph, no revenge, just exhaustion, and the weight of knowing that he'd killed thousands of men to stop the Mongols from killing tens of thousands more, and the math made it necessary, but not glorious. "Bury him with his men," he told a nearby officer. He was wrong, but he was brave. The officer nodded and moved to organize burial details. There would be mass graves, hundreds of them, thousands of bodies that needed to go into the ground before disease started spreading through the army. Days of labor to clean up the aftermath of a battle that had lasted maybe 6 hours from first contact to final pursuit. Qutuz walked back toward the Mamluk camp being erected at the western end of the valley. Exhaustion made each step difficult. Blood on his armor was drying, making the leather stiff. His sword arm hurt from impacts he couldn't remember clearly. Somewhere ahead, his officers, his remaining emirs, Baibars waiting to report on the pursuit's results. Somewhere behind, a valley that would be remembered as the place where the Mongols learned they had limits. But in that moment, walking through the dark with the sounds of wounded men dying slowly all around him, Qutuz understood that victories don't resurrect the dead. The Mongols had killed his family 30 years ago. He'd just killed thousands of Mongols and their allies. The ledger didn't balance. It never would. You don't fight to settle accounts. You fight because the alternative is worse, and sometimes that's enough. The spring at Ain Jalut, spring of Goliath, flowed on through the night, washing blood downstream, cleaning itself slowly, indifferent to the violence that had happened around it. By morning, it would be clear again. The ground would remember. The water wouldn't. That's how history works. The ground stays. The water moves. And men die in between, hoping the ground remembers them better than the water does. The Mamluks buried their dead in mass graves near Ain Jalut, worked through the night and the next day digging trenches large enough to hold thousands, lowering bodies wrapped in whatever cloth they could spare, covering them with earth that would remember what the chronicles might distort. Mongol corpses went into separate pits, not from disrespect, but from logistics, from the understanding that you don't mix your martyrs with your enemies when both religions have specific requirements about burial and neither side has time for nuance when disease threatens the living. By September 5th, 2 days after the battle, the Mamluk army was moving north, not retreating, pursuing, because Qutuz understood that winning a defensive battle meant nothing if the Mongols could regroup in Syria, resupply from their bases in Mesopotamia, and return with fresh troops before Egypt could recover. The victory at Ain Jalut had bought time measured in weeks, maybe months, not years. Never years when you just humiliated an empire that had spent half a century teaching the world that humiliation was fatal. The Mongol survivors fleeing north carried more than wounds. They carried the story. The first major Mongol defeat at their operational peak. The impossible outcome that would be analyzed, debated, explained away, but could never be erased. Kitbuqa dead. His army shattered. The Mamluk slave soldiers standing over Mongol corpses in a valley where the math had said the opposite should happen. Damascus heard the news before the Mamluks arrived. The Mongol garrison, small, dependent on the assumption that reinforcements from Kitbuqa would come if needed, evacuated overnight. I just vanished north toward Mesopotamia, abandoning a city they'd held for 6 months, leaving behind supplies and siege equipment, and the sudden understanding that Mongol occupation had always been contingent on the belief that resistance was suicide. Ain Jalut had killed the belief. The occupation collapsed with it. The Mamluks entered Damascus on September 15th without fighting. The city that had surrendered without resistance to the Mongols in March now welcomed their liberators with the kind of enthusiasm that comes from watching power shift directions and choosing the winning side early. Qutuz rode through streets lined with crowds who'd been bowing to Mongol governors 2 weeks earlier and were now cheering the Sultan who'd done what every ruler from China to Hungary had failed to do. He didn't trust the cheering, understood that Damascus was celebrating survival, not liberation, that these same crowds would cheer whoever held power next month, next year, next decade. Loyalty in medieval cities was a practical calculation about which army could protect you or punish you, not a theological commitment to anyone's cause. Aleppo fell back into Mamluk control days later through similar mathematics. The Mongol garrison looked at the odds, isolated, undersupplied, facing an army that had just destroyed their main force and retreated before the siege equipment could be assembled. Syria, which had been lost in months, was reclaimed in weeks. The speed of the reversal demonstrated something the Mongols had always known and had just been reminded of. Empires are psychological constructs held together by the belief that resistance is impossible. Break the belief and the structure collapses faster than it was built. But retaking territory wasn't the same as securing it. The Mongol Empire still controlled everything from Syria east to China. Hulagu was still alive, still fighting his brothers for the succession, still capable of returning with the full Mongol army once the political situation in Mongolia settled. The Christian allies who'd fought for Kitbuqa, Armenians, Georgians, some Crusader states, were scattered but not destroyed, calculating whether to sue for peace with the Mamluks or wait for Mongol reinforcements that might arrive in a year, or 5 years, or never. And Egypt itself was bleeding from wounds that wouldn't show up in military dispatches. The treasury was empty. The granaries were depleted. The refugee camps outside Cairo still held tens of thousands who needed feeding, while the country tried to rebuild the capacity to feed itself. The Mamluk army had lost maybe a quarter of its strength at Ain Jalut, casualties that would take years to replace, because training slave soldiers from childhood meant your recruitment pipeline operated on decade-long timescales. Qutuz returned to Cairo in mid-October as a hero. The reception was genuine this time, not the political theater of Damascus, but actual relief from a population that had spent months waiting for news that their army had been destroyed and the Mongols were coming. They lined the streets. They threw flowers. They shouted his name like he'd personally held back the apocalypse, which in a sense he had. He rode through it exhausted, not the physical exhaustion of battle, though that lingered, but the deeper fatigue that comes from understanding that you've won a temporary victory against a permanent threat. The Mongols would come again. Maybe not this year, maybe not next year, but eventually. And he'd have to stop them again, or his successor would, and the cycle would continue until one side achieved permanent dominance or exhausted itself trying. The celebrations lasted 3 days. Then came the accounting. Who gets rewarded for Ain Jalut? Which emirs get promotions, land grants, positions of power? How do you distribute the spoils of victory in a system where every ambitious officer is calculating whether they'd be better off with you dead and them in charge? Baibars attended the meetings, accepted his rewards: command of additional territories, increased authority in the formal recognition of his role in the victory, and watched Qutuz with the expression of a man doing complex math. The two of them had needed each other to survive the Mongols. That necessity was ending. They both knew it. October 24th, 1260. 50 days after Ain Jalut. The Mamluk army was returning from Syria, moving south through Palestine toward Egypt in a column that stretched for miles. Qutuz called a halt near Gaza, told his commanders he wanted to hunt, needed a break from the pace, would rejoin the column after bringing down some game. Hunting was normal enough. Medieval nobles did it constantly, combined recreation with displaying martial skill. Nobody questioned it. He rode out with a small party. Baibars was there. So were several other emirs who'd been with Baibars during the planning sessions, who owed him more than they owed Qutuz, who'd done the math on what came next and chosen sides. They cornered him in a dry wadi, maybe a mile from the main column, close enough that screams would carry, far enough that by the time anyone responded, it would be over. Qutuz saw it coming, maybe 5 seconds before it happened, saw the way Baibars and the others positioned themselves, saw the hands moving toward weapons, saw the faces of men who'd made a decision and were committed to it. He reached for his sword, got it halfway out of the scabbard before Baibars' blade took him in the side, angled up into the chest cavity, precise and professional. Baibars? Qutuz said it as a question, like he was confirming a fact he already knew but needed spoken aloud. Blood filled his mouth before he could say anything else. "You won the war," Baibars answered. "I'll win the peace." The other emirs closed in. Multiple blades. No hesitation. No ceremony. Just the efficient murder of a man who'd become inconvenient now that the crisis was over. Qutuz fell from his horse, hit the sand, died there watching the sky fade while his former vanguard commander stood over him and waited to make sure the job was finished. They left his body in the wadi, didn't bury it, didn't mark the location. Rode back to the column and announced that Sultan Qutuz had been killed, vague about the circumstances, clear about the outcome, presenting Baibars as the natural successor who'd already been functioning as the military's strategic mind anyway. The emirs who might have objected looked at the forces Baibars controlled, did the math, and chose acknowledgement over resistance. By sunset, Baibars was sultan. By the next day, the army was moving again. By the end of the month, Qutuz was barely mentioned in official communications, his name becoming the kind of uncomfortable fact that political systems prefer to forget. Former slave saves Egypt from the Mongols, gets murdered 7 weeks later by his own general for political convenience. That's the story, not the simplified version you hear in classrooms where brave Muslims defeat evil invaders through faith and courage. The actual version where the hero dies in a ditch because he was useful during the crisis and dangerous after it, killed by men who'd fought beside him and calculated that gratitude was worth less than power. History is written by survivors, not heroes. Baibars ruled for 17 years, and he was, there's no way to say this diplomatically, extremely competent. Expanded Mamluk territory, crushed the remaining Crusader states piece by piece. Antioch in 1268, fortress after fortress until the Frankish kingdoms were reduced to isolated coastal cities barely holding on. Fought off multiple Mongol invasion attempts in the 1260s and 1270s, every time using variations of the tactics that had worked at Ain Jalut. Choose the ground, force close combat, negate mobility advantages. Built an intelligence network that made the Mamluks the best-informed state in the Mediterranean. Reformed the military, the administration, the postal system. Turned Egypt from a regional power into an empire that would last another 250 years. He was also a murderer who'd killed his sultan for political advancement and spent his reign looking over his shoulder at ambitious subordinates who'd learned from his example that loyalty ended where opportunity began. Both things are true. That's the part that makes history uncomfortable. The Mongol Empire didn't collapse after Ain Jalut. It just learned it had limits. Hulagu eventually won the succession struggle in his region, established the Ilkhanate, the Mongol state controlling Persia, Iraq, parts of Anatolia and ruled until his death in 1265. His successors tried repeatedly to conquer Syria and Egypt. 1281, defeated by the Mamluks at Homs. 1299, temporary occupation of Syria, expelled within months. 1303, final major invasion attempt, destroyed by Mamluk forces who'd spent 40 years perfecting anti-Mongol tactics. The Mongols kept trying for almost half a century. The Mamluks kept winning, not through superior numbers or better technology, but through the same advantages that had worked at Ain Jalut: tactical discipline, heavy cavalry that excelled in close combat, willingness to choose unfavorable strategic positions if it meant favorable tactical ground, and leadership that understood victory meant surviving the day, not just winning glory. And then something stranger happened. In 1295, the Ilkhanate's ruler Ghazan Khan converted to Islam. The entire Mongol state in Persia and Iraq, the empire that had destroyed the Abbasid Caliphate, burned Baghdad, killed hundreds of thousands of Muslims, officially adopted Islam as the state religion, not through conquest, but through absorption. And the religion they'd tried to destroy had simply waited them out and converted their descendants. By 1335, the Ilkhanate collapsed from internal fragmentation, succession crises, and the same administrative problems that destroy every large state eventually. The Mongol Empire in the Middle East ended not with apocalyptic battles, but with bureaucratic failure and conversion to the civilization they'd tried to erase. The irony is heavy enough to feel like divine comedy. Except, there's nothing divine about it, just the historical pattern where empires that expand too fast eventually fragment, where conquerors who stay long enough become the conquered culturally, if not militarily, where the act of ruling transforms you into the thing you overthrew. So what did Ain Jalut actually mean? The textbook version: decisive Muslim victory over Mongol invaders saves Islamic civilization, demonstrates that faith and courage can overcome impossible odds, clean, inspirational, convenient for narratives about religious conflict and heroic resistance. The adult version: a tactical victory that stopped Mongol expansion at a specific geographic point, created a permanent border between the Mamluk Sultanate and the Ilkhanate, and bought Egypt time to consolidate before the next crisis. Strategically significant, historically important, but not the apocalyptic showdown between civilizations that the simplified story suggests. Here's what Ain Jalut didn't do: destroy the Mongol Empire, end the Mongol threat, save Islam globally, prove that faith defeats technology, or demonstrate that smaller forces can beat larger ones through courage alone. The Mongols still ruled from China to Persia. They still controlled millions of Muslims. They still launched invasions of Syria for another 40 years. They just couldn't get past the Mamluks, who'd figured out the tactical counter to Mongol warfare and defended their border with professional brutality for 5 decades. Here's what Ain Jalut did do: prove that the Mongols could be beaten at their operational peak by an opponent who studied their methods and used them better. Establish Egypt as a military power capable of regional dominance. Create a psychological break in the narrative of Mongol invincibility that made future resistance seem possible instead of suicidal. And buy the Mamluk Sultanate time to become the state that would rule Egypt for 257 years, until the Ottomans destroyed them in 1517, using the same playbook of superior tactics and willingness to adapt. The legacy isn't the battle itself. It's the line, the border, the understanding that even seemingly unstoppable forces have limits if you find the ground that negates their advantages and the will to hold it. And Qutuz? The man who chose the ground, sprung the trap, led the charge, saved Egypt, and died in a wadi because he was inconvenient after the crisis passed. His grave is lost, somewhere between Gaza and Cairo. No monument, no tomb, no pilgrimage site, just a name in chronicles and a battle that mattered. The chronicles, Arabic, Mongol, later European, record the battle with varying details but consistent conclusions. The Mamluks won. The Mongols lost. Kitbuqa died. The first major Mongol defeat at their peak. The sources disagree on casualty figures, battle duration, exact positions, who said what to whom. They agree that the outcome was a shock, that something impossible had happened, that the shape of the world had changed in a valley in Galilee. Modern archaeology has found almost nothing at the site. No mass graves, looted centuries ago or eroded by time. No weapons, scavenged immediately after the battle because medieval armies recycled everything that could be sold or reused. Just the spring itself, still flowing, still providing water to the kibbutz built over the battlefield, the ground remembering what the people have mostly forgotten. There's a historical marker now, small, understated, mentioning the battle, the date, the significance. Tourists sometimes stop, read the plaque, try to imagine 40,000 men killing each other in this quiet valley. Fail to imagine it because the violence is gone and the peace makes the past feel impossible. But the spring still flows. The same water Baibars' vanguard drank before the battle, the same pools that turned red that afternoon, the same springs that have been cleaning themselves for 760 years, washing away the blood, forgetting the violence, performing the small miracle of continuation that history demands from the ground long after the humans have finished killing each other. Stand there now and you'd see farmland, greenery. The hills where 15,000 Mamluk cavalry waited in tree lines that don't exist anymore. The valley floor where Kitbuqa died and his army broke, and the Mongols learned they weren't unkillable. All of it peaceful. All of it ordinary. All of it haunted by the afternoon when former slaves stopped an empire and paid for it with thousands of corpses and a sultan who'd be murdered before the year ended. The universal truth isn't complicated. Victory doesn't resurrect the dead. Winning doesn't mean you survive the aftermath. Stopping an empire doesn't prevent the next one from rising. You fight because the alternative is worse, not because fighting solves anything permanently. And the men who do the fighting, the ones who actually stand in the valley when the charge comes, who actually put their bodies between their families and the invasion, those men are usually used by history and discarded by the people who write it. Qutuz was a slave who became a sultan, who stopped the Mongols who died in a ditch murdered by his own officer, who'd also been a slave. Or Baibars was a slave who became a commander, who helped stop the Mongols who murdered his sultan and ruled for 17 years. Kitbuqa was a Christian general who thought God had positioned him to liberate the Holy Land, who died trampled in mud because he took bait designed by someone who understood his confidence better than he did. All of them dead now. All of them reduced to names in chronicles and disputed casualty figures, and a valley in Israel where the spring still flows, and the tourists read a plaque and move on, because history is something that happened to other people in the past, not something that's happening now to you. Except it is. Always. The names change, the weapons improve, the justifications get more sophisticated, but the pattern holds. Empires expand until they hit resistance that makes expansion cost more than it's worth. Wars are won by competence and logistics, and choosing ground carefully. Heroes who save their countries often don't survive the gratitude, and the ground remembers longer than the chronicles do, which is the closest thing to justice that history offers. Ain Jalut Valley, where a giant fell, where an empire stopped, where former slaves bought time with blood, where a sultan died 7 weeks after his greatest victory because victory doesn't protect you from betrayal. The spring still flows. The name persists. Spring of Goliath, where the story tells you the shepherd won, but the truth is messier. The shepherd won, then got killed by his own people. Then his murderer took credit. Then everyone moved on to the next crisis, because history doesn't pause for reflection when there's always another battle waiting. The Mamluks saved Egypt. Then they ruled it for 2.5 centuries. Then the Ottomans destroyed them, using better tactics and more modern weapons. Then the Ottomans collapsed. Then the British came. Then the British left. Then modern nation-states formed from the pieces. The names change. The violence continues. The spring flows. That's the legacy. Not the battle itself, but the reminder that every victory is temporary. Every empire has borders it can't cross. Every hero gets used and discarded. And the ground outlasts everything except the water. And if you made it this far through a story about slave soldiers stopping the Mongol Empire through tactical brilliance and getting murdered for it, drop a comment and tell me which historical betrayal hits harder. Baibars killing Qutuz 7 weeks after Ain Jalut, or the fact that we remember the battle but not the sultan who won it? Next time, the siege that shouldn't have worked, the castle that shouldn't have fallen, and the engineers who made impossible math add up to rubble. You'll want to see this.